My name's Rodney Dillon and we're here on Bruny Island at Adventure Bay. I'd like to acknowledge that this land is Aboriginal land, belonged to our people for many thousands of years, for many generations. I'd like to acknowledge all our ancestors who's come before us and our people who's seen Captain Cook here in the first place and what they must have thought about when they seen that boat coming into the bay here. The things that's gone on since then to our people has been a lot worse than what we could imagine it was going to turn out like. Our people lived on this land here and they was proud people. Once the boat came in, there was nothing but problems for our people. And as for Captain Cook himself, when he came here with the intentions of taking our people's land, and he told lies about our land. This land was always our people's, and he trod over the top of our people. They brought disease, they brought smallpox, they brought terror, they brought racism, they brought religions, they brought all these things to destroy our people. Everything they brought here caused our people damage. And as an Aboriginal person who lives in this area here today, I think of my people here and the agony they went through and how proud I am of those people for how strong they stood up against gunpowder and against ammunition. Our people were slaughtered, but they kept defending their country like brave warriors they was. And I just feel proud to be part of the bloodlines of those people that done that. So thinking of that, would like to welcome people today here on Bruny Island and to our lands. And this is about recognising the things of the past, but also recognising the things of the future, how in welcoming people on this land, about the responsibilities we have together to go ahead in this country. So we want to have a look at what's going to go on in the future and that we have a say, some self-determination. We want to have it so we work together hand in hand like people talk about in reconciliation.
Thank you for joining us today for the University of Tasmania's webinar, Too Many Cooks, Conflicted Narratives in Australia's Visual Histories. This event accompanies an exhibition of the same name. The artworks included in the show explore how the story of Captain Cook, interwoven with other celebrations of Australia's national origins, have created a narrative that obscures not only the impact of European exploration and invasion on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of this continent, but more importantly, the fact that the continent of Australia was in the possession of Indigenous nations at the time and had been for at least 40 millennia. This exhibition is hung in the Plimsoll Gallery of the University of Tasmania on the lands of the Muwinina people, the first nation of Tasmania to be decimated by British invasion. During this webinar, you will hear from some of the artists featured in the exhibition and how their work contributes a critical voice to Australia's visual history. The discussion today will be convened by Professor Ian McLean, Hugh Ramsey Chair of Australian Art History at the University of Melbourne.
Hello everyone, my name's Ian McLean and I'm actually speaking to you from New South Wales. Now, my role here as chair is to, first of all, give you just a very brief introduction, and then I will ask each of the three participants to introduce themselves through their work and to discuss how it relates to the theme of this exhibition, Too Many Cooks. Now, the title of the exhibition, Too Many Cooks, is taken from a series of paintings that an Arnhem Land painter, Paddy Fordham, did. He began the series in 1988. They proved so popular. I'm not sure how many he did, but he did many. His title was very prophetic. He had his own story of Cook as a mythical ancestral figure, which is quite different to the story that we all learnt at school, which we like to call the historical Cook. Now, Paddy Fordham wasn't the only person who had his own ancestral story. Cook has long been a mythical figure in both Aboriginal and settler Australian stories. And whatever his historical achievements, and as Greg intimated in his introduction, there's been a lot of debate about these achievements. I think what this exhibition demonstrates is that his impact as a mythical figure has been far greater than his impact on us now as an historical figure. Mythical figures are what artists are really interested in. What is the myth behind the events that have formed, in this case, modern Australia? Now, mythical figures have a habit of returning in many forms, and this has certainly been the case with Cook. There have definitely been too many Cooks, or perhaps you might think there have not been enough Cooks. Now, each of what I want to do now is to turn this discussion over to the three artists who are introducing themselves. I'm hoping they will tell us a little bit about their own version of Cook, and how this relates to the stories that now circulate and how we think about our identities as an Australian nation, I guess, and our own origin stories, which are still very much in formation. So the order we're going to go in, I'm going to ask Roo Hanks first to talk about his own work, and then we'll go to Julie Goff, and then to Tom Nicholson. So Roo, can I hand it over to you to introduce yourself? Roo. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties that we're having here.
Hi. No, it's all right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Roo Hanks. I've been a printmaker for probably 30 years. I guess I'm well known for producing large format detailed lino cuts. The subject matter has been colonial and post-colonial Australia. It involves obviously historical figures, but also environmental issues and introduced species and those sorts of things. I've won 13 international print prizes and 26 national prizes. Last year I won 2 of Australia's biggest printmaking prizes at the beginning of this year. I guess I'm in most Australian galleries and state galleries and all that sort of thing. So I think that's enough about me. I'll start talking about my work.
Okay, look, we're having, I apologise, we've got 144 participants here, so it's a bit embarrassing for us, but we'll just blame it on Zoom. And while Roo is trying to get his PowerPoint going, I thought maybe what we'll do is go over to you, Julie, and see if yours works. So if you can unmute Julie. Great, thanks.
Hi. Yep, happy to roll. So that's firstly, I'm speaking on the Muinina lands of the Muinina people. I'm a Tasmanian Aboriginal woman whose country is in the far northeast, though my family's country is Tebrakuna, and our people are Trawulway. So I'm speaking from Hobart, however. And in terms of my artworks and process in this exhibition, probably in most, I'm trying to understand what's happened on this island, which Lutruwita, which is has been so devastated by the impact, the effect of colonisation, and so my mother's family, we've been here since time immemorial, and my father's family are Scottish and Irish origin. And yeah, my work is very much trying to untangle and figure out detail in amongst the kind of, the overarching result and inheritance of those first arrivals and disembarkations on our shore. this work, that's one of two featuring in the exhibition, is Manifestation, which is a photographic still of a process of an event that I undertook opposite. It's on the western shore in the northern part of Bruny Island, facing Gunanyi or Purinatere or Anganyaleto, our mountain, our old female mountain. That's Hobart at the base of that. So the burning of the chair is, for me, very much kind of trying to show past, present, but hopefully not forever future, this kind of combined conflagration between what the newcomers brought to us and how we're kind of bound together in that to this day. So the chairs furniture that I often use are kind of symbolic of European arrival and conquest and settlement, so-called, and the spear is one of my ancestral kind of key objects here that continue to be made. So that work is, I suppose, just trying to show what I'm kind of caught in, literally, and maybe then I'm going to speak to a couple more, which are video works in the background now, to speak a little longer on what's on my mind, which in this kind of act of tracing, trawling through what we have, so piecing together the fragments. The other work that's in the exhibition is called Tomala. It's in the same, inhabiting the same space as Manifestation, and it's a video work made more recently. Both these works were made on Bruny Island, which features in the exhibition and in our history as a place of a meeting place, a meeting point between various arrivals of from Europeans. So Cook landed at Adventure Bay, and this film Tomala is it's a meeting between myself and one of our ancestral objects, a kelp water carrier, which is one of our traditional buckets, and made of bull kelp and twined plants, lamandra or iris plant, and stick handle. So this kelp carrier is held in the British Museum, and it's been absent from our shores since 1851. And the title of the video is Tomala, means a long way. It's just silent, but you can hear it if you go to when the exhibition is launched online. You can gain the link to the full film with the sound. But this is showing that I'm in trying to reunite these elements that are, as I said, fragmented and dispersed since arrival and colonization, in particular here. I find that I have to often visit our cultural objects held far, far away, which I find particularly distressing and disturbing. And it's the same as visiting and thinking about our ancestors that were lost to us and sent across the world to many collections, and trying to retrieve those. So this is the water in Adventure Bay where Cook landed himself, and the kelp water carrier went across for the Great Exhibition in London in 1851. So it's been in London since that time. So it was very, I found very moving experience and sad to be able to see it and hold it through rubber, and to kind of not be able to take it, bring it back home. I'm one of very few fortunate people that's been able to spend time with that object since my ancestors last saw it. So this is where I collected the kelp and made one that was then exhibited with the video some years ago, and I created it using the same techniques, the kelp carrier I made, in a kind of homage to this one that was able to see in London. So yeah, it's just, this work is showing my process of undertaking a journey and creating an outcome that can be shown in an art gallery, for example, but the action and the learning and the also more and more involving my family in different what might be seen as art endeavors, but they're more about culture and reclamation and learning and continuing and survival. So this is very much for me. I'm glad that the video eventuated, but there was more to it than this. It's kind of documentation of life that then becomes an artwork at one level. Yeah. And so, yeah, there's these parallels and congruences between thinking about shorelines in these two works that are in this exhibition of mine are very much, very, very much about that, strangers on the shore, and what did eventuate, and what we're trying to return to us. In as much as when I look at this object, most of my ancestors and family were exiled offshore, much in the manner of our cultural material. So they're really about us, not just not only our objects of culture. So yeah, that's good to see. I suppose it's useful to see how this looks, this place where so much happened, and so much we will never know also happened. And the southern part of Tasmania was rife with these visitations from the Dutch, and then the French and British just landing and usually departing. And then the next video I'm going to show, which is my first video work from using videotape. So it's not very high resolution, but it kind of grounds this beyond the shoreline into the interior of Lutruwita, Tasmania, because it kind of is a starting point. When I picked up a video camera the first time, this was 2009, and it was actually loaned to me from the video department in the art school. So, like 2-minute walk from Plimsoll Gallery, I was loaned this camera, and I promised I wouldn't drop it in a river but it was videotape, 2009. So this work's called Driving Black Home, and it's been more the focus than the shorelines, in a sense, for me as an artist, that there's more work that has eventuated from walking, driving, also kayaking in rivers through the lands that we don't otherwise have access to, usually through otherwise, because of the fences and the gates, that I'm a bit obsessed by the amount of country we can't easily see and be on at this point in time. So this work is, I thought, useful to show a little portion of it. It's actually 3 hours and 43 minutes long, so only myself and the film editor have sat through this film. I wouldn't expect anyone to do so. It was created for an opportunity to exhibit in a colonial estate called Clarendon in the north of Tasmania, and I placed it as a projection in the basement, sort of like the sort of dirty secrets of colonization. So the purpose of the film is really, again, that learning for me, the process of actually transcribing and learning about the land grants, like what happened post-Cook, post these visitations, and the landfalls and the flag raisings. There's much more dire consequence. They kind of presaged, and they are kind of these figures. The ships just led to basically much more dire consequence, which is the amount of land that we lost country. So we lost 3,125 grants of land were allocated in 28 years. So this is the duration of the film, is to me kind of parallel to our experience of kind of the weighting, the immensity of the colonial project. When it was shown in Clarendon in the basement, I was told when I went at the end, it was packing up, that it was really, a lot of people went and sat and watched it for a long time. And I was really perplexed by this, because I thought anyone will watch a couple of minutes and get the point. But what I found, or what I heard, was that colonists, descendants of these people that gained the land, were sitting and waiting until they could see proudly their ancestors' names. So it became the complete reversal of how I see it, as a kind of listing of loss for me, and others are seeing it as their kind of their heritage of pride. So the settler story rather than the colonizing story. So it's very interesting to place art out in the world and not know how it will be taken and who will see it, what they will read in that work. So this idea of too many cooks and the exhibition about this multitude of possible ways of viewing these newcomers that came on the ship but didn't get off for so long is, for me, really translates into this work of the result, which is too many colonists, and then the work multiplied in trying to unpack what happened across this island. In recent work, I've been focusing more and more on what happened to particular, so it's like biographies of our people, and for each of those that were given land grants, there's so many others of our own ancestors that were exiled, killed, and also a huge number of Aboriginal children, 185 I think I can name to date, who were living with colonists before 1850. So on this island, so they are associated with these names of these families that have the land at this period, and by taking the land there, also in some of these families instances taking their children. So I think it's this interconnection that's really, for me, I'm obsessed with trying to understand it more, and it's not so fragmented as I thought once you start pulling it apart and from different ways, bringing it back together for different art outcomes. That helps as well. So yeah, it's just an ongoing process of finding the connections and being on country. The artworks take me to places and undertake actions that I otherwise perhaps wouldn't continue to the extent that I do, to reach some kind of conclusion, not definitive, but enough to say, okay, I can move left or right now. I kind of have an understanding now. So yeah, I'll leave it there for the moment. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie, for that. I too found the long film very mesmerising and interesting because it was so mesmerising. I could see why an audience would just sort of sit there and watch it. And I thought it was very interesting how you link the theme of too many cooks to too many colonists, all these names, and that just keep coming and keep coming. And I presume the land grants, I was having a bad connection, so I couldn't hear everything you said, but I presume the land grants were back in the 19th century, but the way you see the film is that the land grants are still coming. And so it introduces to me a very strong sense of the temporality of colonialism. We too easily have a sense of, oh, Cook was so long ago and that happened all so long ago. And I think this idea of too many cooks that Paddy Fordham had, it is, I think that's one of his main ideas of this sort of temporality of these cooks. It just keeps returning because that's what ancestral beings do and myths do. They don't go away very easily. They come back in different forms. And so I thought that film really drove that home. So I don't know if you want to respond to that at all.
No, it is entirely that as and it's entirely that because it's actually untruthfully so that so many of the original land grants are still have the same property name on the fence as the 1820s or 30s. So yeah, it's literally so, and it feels like that this island is haunted with what has happened here, and so yeah, it's all one, the past, the present. I don't find it very separated at all.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Now I believe Rue is sorted out technically. Is that right, Rue? Will we try it again?
Mute. So, been unmuted. Okay. How do I? Okay, are we going next? Let's hit the next image. Might be a good idea. It's unstable. That's exciting. Aha, here we go. Look, I obviously produced this. It's a small lino cut. It was basically me exploring Captain Cook. I guess as a 10-year-old schoolboy, I got taken out to Cornell on an excursion, and this is obviously where Cook landed, and you know, he was the founder of Australia, and that's the sort of, I guess, type of propaganda we were fed. And then later on, when I started to explore a lot of colonial themes and imagery, I obviously found out there were many versions, and often I come across lots of versions that I will incorporate some of them and make up my own version. I do black and white lino cuts, obviously inspired by woodcut artists from the 17th and 18th century from England. This piece is basically a discovery of Cook, and it sort of has the idea of the club and the knife, because some historians say that he was stabbed, some people say he was clubbed to death. Up in the right-hand corner, there's a shrunken skull, and there was dreadful rumours that the Hawaiians were cannibals and all those exciting things. It's got his sexton, it's got all those sorts of things. It's surprising how many people have purchased this print without actually knowing a lot about Cook. So it's more a decorative type thing. Up in the centre, just above Cook's head, is a small coffin-shaped memento box. And the sailors, after he was killed in Hawaii, collected a lock of hair and painted a very small portrait, a landscape of Hawaii, and sent it back to his wife, Elizabeth. So let's go on to this next image, please. Oh. Who's doing that? Excellent, thank you. Okay, with my work, I guess I basically, not very subtly, look, the Cook, he goes in and out of fashion a bit. He's obviously big fashion at the moment. However, I guess I see him as, I guess we've got to look at what happened 250 years ago, and he was a very successful navigator, explorer, supposedly quite an honest person, carried out his job phenomenally well. But I think he's become a bit of a scapegoat, and so he's this symbol of invasion, and I guess I've carried that sort of ethos as well. I've twisted the idea that he was killed in Hawaii, and cane toads that came to Australia came from Hawaii, originally from South America. So I guess I see that the Brits I see them as cane toads taking over Australia. It's slightly bland. It's meant to be humorous, but and it's far-fetched and all those sorts of things. But I guess my work's satirical, but it also has a bit of bite to it. Here I've depicted Cook with Banks. There was a little bit of rivalry between them. Cook couldn't fund, I think it was his second expedition, and Banks said, yes, I've got the funds. Cook gave him a very tiny cabin, of which he said, no, not good enough. I've got all these scientists coming with me. My cabin will be the same size as yours. I don't know if that's true or not. You always read different versions. This is Captain Cook playing golf, obviously, and the golf ball becomes cane toads, which is very apparently used to be common practice in Queensland. I get reprimanded when I say There's St Andrews over there, the home of golf and all those sorts of things. I guess I'm having a go at sport in Australia as well. How Australia likes to fund sport rather than art and rather the environment. So I'm having another cross dig at that. Captain Cook, he's got his sash round the middle, and he's just won first Australian golfing championships. I've got Cook in the background. The clouds are sort of nice and ethereal. He's exploring the world, and Banks did too. Banks was a bit more complex character. People often comment on his slightly awkward foot. Banks had gout, they say, from too much drinking and all those sorts of things. If you ever want people to be distracted, put a copulating cane toad in your work, because people go, oh, look at the toads. It's actually quite a lot more to it than that. I think we should, that's enough on that image. Let's have another image, please. Hugh, can we have the next image, please?
There is one up there, Roo. The fox painting is up there.
Oh, sorry, it just came through. Okay, this is a combination. It was several artworks that I put together. It's a well-known Eugene Philip Fox, who's just above the sheep's head. The original that he painted, and there was two Aboriginals, but I've slightly cynically called them black boys, and there's tree grass plants, which they are called now. I'm presenting Cook as a pacifist, and saying that we don't have to obviously destroy the native population, but we can import cane toads, cats, absolutely everything else. An Aboriginal artist by the name of David Boyd produced a wonderful painting of the same work, but on the flag it has a skull and crossbone, of which I've added to Cook's hat. And unfortunately it was Cook who actually did fire the first shot and wound I think a fisherman in the knee or something. So there's lots of contradictions there. And over here, I've got La Perouse, who unfortunately, fortunately gave all his journals and maps and everything to Cook to take back. And La Perouse and I think four or five from the fleet were actually wiped out by a cyclone. So that's sort of pretty much, there's lots more to it, but I think that's enough. Let's move on to this next image, would be good.
It's up there, Roo. You can.
I'm not receiving it at all. Yeah.
Bay Hotel image.
It takes a while to come through. Sorry, that's all. Surfing the Bombora. They witnessed surfing for the first time in Hawaii. I've got Captain Cook fairly seriously learning how to surf. Okay, there's a cane toad on the back of the board. He's obviously come to the Pacific to view the transit of Venus, which is obviously happening up in the sky. And he's like good old Australians, many of them ignore science. So there's Botticelli's, Venus in the tent. They've got Ned Kelly having a beer with his helmet on. So there's lots of sort of cynicism. His wife made that beautiful vest for him, which he never received. And so, okay, that's there's a few other things, images, but we haven't got time. So thank you. Let's move on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Roo. Can you hear me, Roo? Your image is frozen. I think, can you hear me, Roo?
Yep.
Oh,
Sure.
yeah. I just thought I'd ask you a quick question. I've noticed that in the last 30 years or so, there have been many works of art about Cook by Aboriginal artists, but very few non-Aboriginal artists seem willing to go there. It's as if Cook is too much of a lightning rod or something. So I was just wondering why you have gone there in such a big way. You've almost become
Yes.
Mr. Cook.
Well, unfortunately, he's a bit of a burden actually, because I mean they tend to sell fairly well in Sydney. So, and I am going to do some more, but I'm going to do a series on Bruny Island and all sorts of things. I guess he's a symbol, and I do make fun of him, but I make fun of Australians. And I am very passionate about Indigenous history. And I think, like Julie said, that it's not so much what happened in the past. I mean, from 250 years ago, it's more what's happened since then. And I think that's what we should focus on. I know we should acknowledge, people's arrivals and all those sorts of things, but I think we should tell an honest history and then sort of get on with it. So it's unfortunate that it becomes so politically and emotionally sort of destructive in some ways. But look, I like Captain Cook. I guess I have. I guess we're sort of bonding to a certain degree. But I guess I use him as a bit of a pawn, like I have here in this last piece about colonial history and post-colonial history in Australia.
Okay, thanks, Roo. Let's move across to Tom. Can you hear me, Tom? You have to unmute.
Yep, I can hear you.
Great.
And I'll just begin to share my PowerPoint. Can you see that image okay?
Yep. Let's come up.
Great. Thanks for the invitation to join this discussion. It's an honour to be both working with Greg again and in a show with Julie again. And I'm sorry I'm not in Hobart. My name's Tom Nicholson. I'm in Melbourne, where I live and work. And I want to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation, the original owners of the land on which I live. Part of that is to acknowledge that the consequences of invasion are unresolved morally, legally, and economically. I wanted just to talk about one work, which is the work which appears in the exhibition. It's a collaborative work with Greg. So Greg, if I miss anything in this account of how the work came into being, please interrupt. It's called Interview, and there's an image of it here as it was shown at the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology in Cambridge a number of years ago, where it was shown alongside another individual work. Sorry. This individual work, which responds to the same drawing, which was the basis of my collaboration with Greg and the basis or the beginning of the work, which I'm going to talk about now. That work is this drawing here, and interestingly, it's the site of this drawing is very, very close to the geography that Julie was describing in her presentation. It's Weber's drawing an interview between Captain Cook and the natives. And it's a work which I was very lucky to see during a research trip to look at material in the UK. I took a train a few hours down to Portsmouth to the Naval Archive where this drawing is held. And I guess it's a drawing which is most famous for being the earliest known European image of contact. And after I'd had the very good fortune to see this work, when I got back to Australia, I actually got in contact with Julie. And I'm very grateful to Julie because she, in hearing what I'd seen, she said that I should contact Greg Lehman. And I sent an email to Greg and we met in Geelong. And we began a conversation which continues to this day. And we began really thinking about this image and began the process of making the work which is in this exhibition. And one of the first things that Greg and I talked about was the strangeness of the site itself where the drawing is located. Greg had been there a couple of years before me. He'd made that same trip. And the drawing is, as I said, in a naval archive, which means that to get there, you have to go through a whole lot of military security clearances. And it means that by the time you get to the drawing, the military character of Cook as a naval man is very much in your mind. And I think it's an extremely interesting context in which to see this drawing. One of the other things that was present for both Greg and me is something quite straightforward in a way, but which I think is very interesting, which is its physicality. It's an enormous drawing. It's made of two, I think Greg has postulated, and I think this is right, it's two pieces of chart paper stuck together. And because it's very fragile, you can only look at it on a horizontal surface. So it's actually very hard to see. I had to very surreptitiously and quickly stand on a chair in the Naval Archive to take this photo to fit the drawing into the photograph. And there's something of this tension actually built into the drawing itself in that, for the most part, the drawing feels like Weber opportunistically already tracking to a grand history painting, which would depict this encounter, which is actually a kind of confection of two events from two different days. And he places, it mostly feels like he's already thinking about that grand history painting, and there's a lot of idealizing and generalizing going on. And he also situates himself and us a long way from the scene. At the same time that I think actually the most interesting parts of the drawing where he's not projecting, we actually sense him being there, is that he gives a kind of brief account of the scarification on the upper bodies of the men at the very front of that group. And there you sense that he was actually very close to the encounter. I think that's the really interesting part of the drawing in a way. But in a way, the encounter has this tension in it where on the one hand, the drawing is so big that you're too close to it, at the same time that the drawing compositionally has you very awkwardly far away from the scene. After that first conversation with Greg, I was very lucky to go down to Tasmania and meet with a mutual friend, Peter Hay. And Pete drove me to Bruny Island. And we drove around for a while. At a certain point when we got to Adventure Bay, we pulled over to stretch our legs. And I walked out onto the beach and in a slightly daydreamy way, just walked out onto the rocks and then turned around and suddenly found myself, much to my surprise, looking at the same headland that appears in the Weber drawing. And it was at that point that I guess I realised that although the event which Weber is showing in this drawing is a kind of confection, I think is orchestrated to give and designed to give Cook a kind of heroic centrality in the scene, the place that he is drawing, and which is evident in that right-hand part of the drawing, is a very, very specific place. Greg and I, some months later, decided to head to the same place with this to scale copy of the drawing and to have a dialogue which would be recorded and then transcribed as a kind of work and as a response to that image and to the site. And we went to Two Tree Point, as it's called, on Adventure Bay, also accompanied by Pete Hay and Rachel Rose. And we began to talk about that drawing again. And interestingly, I think to talk about what happens between the drawing and the site, which is an incredibly interesting thing to do. And I was thinking of that, the way that a site or a landscape can become something else when I was watching Julie's video, the way that those names, in a way, in a very mesmerising way, transforms the way that we read and understand the landscape we see through the front windscreen of the car. One of the things that I think is interesting for both Greg and me about that drawing is that Weber's drawing is very, very anomalous. Like it's the only drawing which he made of this kind which was never published, neither as a painting, which it seems to want to become, nor as an engraving, which all of the other drawings did become and were published in the published account of Cook's voyage. It also was separated from all of the other drawings. So all of Weber's drawings went to the British Library, except for this one, which ended up in that very strange naval archive. And in that conversation with Greg, one of the things we discuss is the very odd relationship that this drawing has to Weber's most famous image, which is this, the death of Cook, which of course depicts an event from later in the same voyage. And it's not just that Weber seems to use the gesture of Cook from that moment on Bruny Island. It's also that compositionally it takes place at a shoreline with a kind of bifurcated compositional structure with the British on the left and the natives on the right. And I guess we began to postulate that maybe one of the reasons why the Weber's drawing is never published as a print or made into a painting is that in a very odd way, that drawing from Bruny Island sort of becomes the preparatory drawing for another moment in the same voyage. It becomes, in a very strange way, the preparatory drawing for this painting. And what I think is then quite curious about that is that this gesture of Cook's from Weber's painting, which seems to come from Bruny Island, gets used in this painting, which we've sort of already seen through Rue's presentation, by Phillips Fox, which is made at the moment, a nationalist moment where Australia federates, so that in a weird way, Weber's painting, but also the drawing from Bruny Island tracks forwards to that nationalist moment of federation at the same time that this painting makes it go backwards in time to 1770, 7 years earlier than the Weber drawing, again, making Cook a kind of beneficent, kind of imperial presence in the middle of the picture. So there's something I think interesting in that echo through images of Cook that's a very ahistorical but imagistic chain of events around Cook. I just want to make really one more point about that drawing. But before I do, just to note two things which I think are really, well, one thing, a double presence, which is very extraordinary at that site, which you can see in this image. And that is that that point was named by the British Two Tree Point because there were two very remarkable trees at that point. And it's an incredible thing in that site and was a very remarkable presence for that dialogue from Greg and me, that those two trees are still there. That they were witnesses to that encounter, to that first European act of image making around contact, and they are still there. And it's a very remarkable presence of country in any encounter with that place. The final thing that I really wanted to say, and I think it's the most important thing about that work that Greg and I made, and an interesting thing about the Weber drawing, is that at a certain moment in that conversation between Greg and me, Greg wandered up onto that headland, which appears on the right-hand side of the Weber drawing. And with anyone who's had the pleasure of walking with Greg on any stretch of country, he has incredible acuity and curiosity. And he realised that headland is in fact a midden. And I think that for me, was the most extraordinary moment in this project, because this drawing, which is famous for being the earliest known European image of contact, which in a way where Weber he wants to put Cook at the middle of it, and he wants to make Cook the protagonist and a kind of beneficent man of empire who's giving a Cook medallion to an Aboriginal man whose name we aren't given, but who's given both the status as a kind of leader, but also subjugated to Cook. And in all of that kind of fantasy that Weber is trying to project about Empire and Cook, actually the drawing is also recording something else. And in fact, it records it in a much more substantial way. And that's at the very perimeter of the picture. It records inadvertently, or maybe Weber even knew, it records a midden. And that seems to be such an important thing, like both as a political point, as a refutation of the mythology which is built around Cook and that pernicious mythology of invasion and terra nullius. That this image actually, in a very strange way, we can find something in it which speaks against that, that mendacious claim. But also I think it says something about images themselves, that images very often want to do something, they want to project something, but inadvertently they contain all of these other meanings and implications and possibilities. And the fact that this drawing is actually also a drawing of something, a presence or a form which is probably many thousands years old in this drawing, I think says something about the role of images, not just in thinking about the past, but in imagining forwards towards alternative futures. That's Greg's hand holding some of the shells, which also appear in that midden. And just as a final image, this is a detail of the work, which presents a kind of plinth of a double poster with the Weber drawing at scale underneath a folded version of the same posters, which then become a booklet which houses a transcription of that dialogue at that site. And the title of the work, Interview, refers obviously to the title of the Weber drawing, an interview between Captain Cook and the natives. It's a play with the etymology, I guess, of the word interview, which implies both looking and speaking. But it also, I think, is playing a little bit with distribution, which of course is a critical process both for images and for empire and the process of colonisation. Cook in that image is giving a medallion. And of course, Weber's images come to be distributed as engravings in a way that's meant to proliferate the claims of empire, including the claims upon this continent. And the form of this work as a takeaway, as something which you can take from the gallery and take home and even put on the wall at home, I suppose is designed to set up some related process of distribution, which might be the beginning of trying to think against the claims of Weber's drawing and against the claims of Cook and what he means in our culture.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Thanks, Tom.
No worries.
One of the amazing things to me about that story is the medallion was actually found, I think, 120 years later or something.
No, it is.
In a field. And,
yeah.
And again, it sort of illustrates how time is always with us in that respect.
Yeah.
Do we know when the drawing was made?
Greg, you should feel free to chime in because I think you know much more about that drawing than me. I think when Greg and I have talked about it, we've surmised that because of the scale of the sheet of paper and the fact that you can see from the washes that it was made on a horizontal surface, that it was probably made back on the ship on the basis either of a memory or a smaller set of drawings that we no longer have. But when you see how detailed the account of that headland is, it also seems, and also because there's a very big rocky area which would be a good place to sit and make the drawing, it's not impossible to imagine that at least some of it was made on the beach, but it would have been pretty hard, I think, to make a drawing that big on a beach, just practically speaking. But yeah, I think that's at the time at least, that was sort of what Greg and I speculated about, but
yeah,
that it was either back on the ship or possibly partly made there.
Because it strikes me that it's so composed, as you point out, that it's probably based on some sketches made when he was there, certainly landscape sketches, with the idea of developing a large history painting or a larger history painting. So I sort of, you know, given your very interesting point about the painting on the death of Cook, I sort of wonder, was the drawing made after Cook was killed? Maybe on the long journey back home, and you know, especially given that gesture. Anyway, it's a purely speculative question. I know you don't have the answer. I don't expect you to.
No, I mean, I think that
answer.
Yeah, I don't know what you think, Greg, but I think that whether it was made very close, you know, on Bruny Island or very soon afterwards or later, I think it's that character of the drawing is quite opportunistically tracking towards a grand history painting, that in a way the drawing is compositionally too awkward to ever achieve. But it's that's very clearly the purpose of the drawing, and in its effort to kind of heroicize Cook, it's clearly heading in that direction, and although it never becomes a painting or an engraving, it does seem to then join or to be the beginning of a chain of other paintings, including the Phillips Fox, which continue that kind of a heroicizing of Cook, but also a kind of, a type of ahistorical treatment of Cook, which I think is something which is very characteristic of his place in the culture more broadly.
Yeah. I'll ask this question to you, Tom, first, but you know, the other two panelists might like to answer it too. It's interesting to me that I think there's over 100 memorials to Cook in the world, and over half of them are in Australia. Yet Cook was not really interested in Australia. He was interested in the Pacific. And so why do you think Australia, where Cook, you know, which was sort of peripheral to Cook's three voyages, why is it that it's Australia who has taken on Cook as their sort of ancestral figure more than any other nation? Why he's not in New Zealand? There are memorials to him, but they don't take it on to the extent that Australia has, or even England has. Australia is where Cook has, if you like, come home to rest. Have you got any thoughts on that? You know, why Cook and not, say, Philip, or whom you think might be the more obvious, you know, the more obvious person?
I mean, it's certainly not my area of expertise. The way that I would begin to try to answer that is in a very Melbourne way, which is, you know, like the main presence of Cook in this city is that very absurd thing, Cook's Cottage. And Cook's Cottage was actually, you know, brought to Melbourne for the 100th anniversary of Batman. So it's a very bizarre allusion that, like, to celebrate, in inverted commas, Batman, we bring Cook's Cottage to a place Cook never came to. And I think that allusion of those two figures in a completely ahistorical way, which of course doesn't acknowledge the violence of both, is symptomatic of the kind of existential desperation that necessitates these figures of legitimation. Like, if you don't acknowledge a history of invasion and violence and dispossession, then you need these figures to somehow fill the void. And Cook's Cottage and the way that it sort of elides those two figures who are historically very different, but are both deeply implicated in violence, but feels like that's maybe the beginning of an answer to your question, Ian. And I'd like to hear what Julie thinks, and Greg, from also the position of Tasmania. But I think that the absence of legitimation and the existential difficulty of acknowledging the history of this place makes figures like Cook and Batman necessary as sort of just but only in a very ahistorical way.
Yeah, which again, I guess, underlies the mythical aspect, the sort of mythical narrative that Cook has become, rather than an historical narrative. So let's ask our panelists, and even Greg might want to throw in something, and then we'll open it up to Q&A to our 150 or so listeners if they have any questions. Do you want to say anything, Julie?
I think I agree that there's a very big problem with the founding, like finding a founding narrative here for the British, and kind of inventing, like scrabbling to find. So yeah, let's bring a cottage from England. And I think, is that right, that cottage, they brought ivy over as well, like the plant, like an introduced plant to grow on that cottage, or is that a myth?
I would believe, I don't know, but I would believe it. They apparently numbered every brick.
Oh, yeah, so it's just a bit dire. So yeah, I think we need an audit, a memorial audit, and to work out, like, just be very interesting to see how much, it is of, studiously the wars fought off this continent rather than those that were fought valiantly here by the First Peoples. How many memorials are for people born in the UK, and why? How many are for explorers? Like, all it's yeah. Just let's get a bit of an audit happening and work out what kind of, it's kind of obscene, disgraceful, and ludicrous. What for me to just consider what they are, what job they're doing and have done, and they need a bit of a review.
Was chosen as a distraction because as he was fatally wounded, so therefore he was risen into this sort of odd icon, that he may have done bad things, but he ended up dying for his passion for discovering things. So was it a slight deflection?
Deflection from what?
From the invasion and all those other aspects.
Well, when he died, the invasion hadn't even started in Australia. I guess that's one of the other absurdities about Cook.
But I mean, as far as later, but his reputation grew over the century, over the decades. It wasn't,
Yeah.
I think it's true that the dates of memorials is really interesting, like when they're instated and how much later or different to, the events that happened or those people are associated with. There's a real discrepancy that's really interesting. So yeah, more work before. Yeah, would be good.
But it is an interesting point, Roo, because I think the first public statue of Cook was the one in Hyde Park, which was made to commemorate his death, 100 years afterwards. But an interesting story about the cottage is that when it was put up for auction, I think in the late 20s, it was stipulated that it had to stay in England. But Grimwade offered twice as much as anyone else. So they changed that it had to stay in the British Empire so that it could still go to Australia. And that maybe tells us something about why Cook is so important to many Australians, because of that sort of empire connection. Greg, did you want to? I could see you wanting to say something.
Thanks, Ian. No, actually I wasn't. I was just musing about how hard Tom had tried to draw me into the conversation. Thanks, Ian. Perhaps we'll open it up to and continue this conversation with the artists, but also start to pick up some of the questions that have been coming in from the participants. And firstly, I'd like to just thank everybody for their forbearance in what was a slightly shaky start. And thank goodness, or is it thank Telstra or someone else, that the connections have seemed to have firmed up, and the webinar has really settled in and is rocking along, and I'm just finding it absolutely fascinating. And I trust that 135 participants out of 150 or so who started are all here because they're really enjoying it too. There's somebody who is key in all of this that that has been a bit missing so far, and he appears in Ruth's in one of Ruth's prints, and that's Joseph Banks, who is kind of the he's the rock star in this whole story, the bad boy. Ruth, there's a couple of audience members who are really keen to hear what people think about Banks in all of this. Could we perhaps start, Roo, with what you were trying to draw out of the figure of Banks in that engraving? And Hugh, are you able to bring that back up? Can you share that screen, Hugh, please? That's the one. Thank you. So we can all see that now, Roo.
Okay. Right, the one of Banks. Look, I guess I was showing that idea that Cook was the figurehead, the superstar, and Banks was a secondary person, which was not true at all. Banks was a celebrity in London, obviously. However, Banks inherited a phenomenal amount of money, so he could actually pick and choose what he wanted to do. And he was quite demeaning to a lot of other colleagues that actually worked their tails off, and he ended up taking a lot of kudos from it. So although he did a phenomenal job collecting, but he had a very good support team. I have done several prints of Banks by himself, and I've produced, you know, as this superstar and all that sort of thing as well. So I think it was an interesting partnership. But anyway.
And perhaps while we've got you, Roo, but also Tom, there's been a couple of questions come in about asking about non-Aboriginal artists speaking, stepping up to the plate, if you like, and speaking about invasion and what sort of authority, what sort of insight, what's the terrain of sensitivity, and what are the implications of that for the sort of investigation and commentary that artists make through their work. Do you feel that, Roo? Right at that moment, Roo seems to have... Are you back with us, Roo? You're frozen.
Keep dropping out. Sorry. Yeah, sorry, I missed it. Maybe Tom should pick it up. Sorry.
Tom, did you hear the question? It's about the role of the non-Aboriginal artist in commenting about invasion and things that are, you know, often the origin of generational trauma for Aboriginal people. It's quite an issue today in terms of representation. How can one voice represent another? Tom?
Thanks for the question, whoever in the audience posed it. I think it's a question that I try to think about pretty much every day as an artist, and also that I try not to think of as a general question, but one which has a different shape with every historical moment that you address as an artist, or each image that is addressed as an artist. So, and I think over working with different projects and mainly trying to engage the history and realities of the place where I live, or in Melbourne, each work presents those questions, I think, in a slightly different shape. I mean, I'd probably begin to have a go at answering that question by actually remembering a Q&A years ago where I remember an audience member asking some filmmakers who made that film Van Diemen's Land actually why there weren't Aboriginal people present in the film, and the answer was that they didn't feel that they could represent the experiences of others. And that struck me as a difficult response I don't agree with, because of course the effect of it was that then there was an Aboriginal absence from the film. It actually, in a weird way, perpetuated a long history of image making in this country where Aboriginal people are made absent. And so I think I begin, like in approaching each project in that question, I sort of tend to begin from the fact that that it's not possible to represent my experience without grappling with or engaging the experiences of others, in the sense that we're already co-implicated. And I mean that both in a general sense, as a kind of anti-Thatcherite thing. Like I don't believe there is no society. Like I believe that we're deeply bound up in one another's experiences of the world. But I also think that that's true in relation to the colonial histories and realities of this place, that we're already co-implicated, and our responsibilities, not just as artists, but as teachers and nurses and everything, are to reckon with that and its complexities. And I guess a kind of a first rule of thumb is not to speak for others. And I always try to embed in the work my own position as a non-Aboriginal artist in some way. And also to acknowledge that, you know, like this word shared history is often used, and I think it's a tricky word, because the history is shared in very, very asymmetrical ways, both in the sense that the violence and disrespect is very asymmetrical, profoundly so, but also it's redoubled in an asymmetry of telling, that the telling of that history has been dominated by non-Aboriginal people. So there's a bind in both wanting to refuse the overwhelming, willful amnesia of that history of representation, at the same time that it's very necessary for the predominant response to come from Aboriginal people and Aboriginal voices. So there are tensions in that, which I hope that the work itself reflects. And the project that I briefly spoke about today, Interview, I don't think it's an accident that it involves a conversation, and it precisely deals with two voices, yours and mine, Greg, encountering that site and that image. And in a way, I hope that the work, amongst other things, apart from being about that image and that site, it's also partly about the complexity, but also the urgent necessity of precisely reckoning with that question that you posed to me.
Thank you, Tom. Some really good questions coming in here. I'm glad we've got a little bit more time and people can hang with us, because this is going really well, I think. We've had a comment from somebody that Joseph Banks' fortune actually came from the profits of the slave trade. So it's an interesting background to his influence and celebrity, which often, flows from opportunity. Julie, that same comment included a couple of questions to throw to you, and I'll combine that with an earlier question that came in. Mm-hmm. The names of the settlers in your film are recognisable to Tasmanian historians. Many of them were members of police and military parties who fought Aboriginal people in the Black War in Van Diemen's Land, or they were members of roving parties. So, how do you figure these characters whose family names are still with us, because a lot of those original land grants are still in the hands of the families. So they've only passed once in ownership, and that is from the original traditional owners to the current descendants.
Mm. Yeah, I didn't think it was possible, the kind of dialogue that, like, what Tom and yourself have been going through, that, like, the conversation, the interview, I wasn't sure that could happen. And so I kept thinking it's this kind of immutable, monstrous mass of colonists that still have the land, but we can't meet anywhere. and there's not access for us past, through the gate. But over the last couple of years, there's been some approaches made by people with the well-known surnames to me, just at exhibitions, which is interesting, this sort of neutral ground that maybe an exhibition or a gallery presents, that possibility. So artists don't necessarily spend much time in galleries. We make our work and kind of deliver and disappear. So I've had the chance to spend some time with some of my artworks, give a floor talk, and then be approached by these names that you're mentioning, names of colonial families that were the wealthier, all different levels of society were in the military here, and the constabulary were often ex-convicts or even still serving their sentences and placed in power. So, anyway, yeah, the approach has been made to me in the last couple of years where people are confessing about their family histories to me, and I feel there is a possibility of the interview and the conversation and an outcome of more access to country and more truth-telling to happen. So I think I'm trying to change my kind of internal belief that nothing could change into, there is the power of positive thinking, and it kind of can change in that well-meaning colonists are welcoming Aboriginal people back on country that is not in the Western legal sense seen as ours any longer, but welcome back to projects of caring for country, for example, and also for our own purposes on country with accessing particular sites, etc., like living sites. But also there seems to be more potential for other kinds of relationships to be formed. So that was a very long answer. I'm just thinking, if you'd asked me 4 years ago, I just thought it was this, like the names on the film, I could not get beyond that and beyond accessing information that's in the archives. But it seems conversations and more than that can happen. Some families have even returned land to the Aboriginal community.
There's been a few questions coming about about the future, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But Ian, you've been focused a lot in recent years on the idea of the post-national, and something that one of our participants raised in the Q&A is an observation that, while Cook seems to be very big in New South Wales in particular, and of course he gets mentioned and foisted onto other parts of Australia, but in Western Australia the focus is much more on the Dutch, who of course preceded Cook. Here in Tasmania, we know about Cook, but I think the people that we have the most perhaps romantic fondness for are the French, and certainly, one of the French visits here under the command of Bruni d'Entrecasteaux was incredibly successful, and there was amity and very much there, and it was a very successful encounter, unlike the previous one with Dufresne and also Bourdain's that ended badly. So, does this? What do you make of this? I mean, the nation state is something that we all take for granted, but it's a relatively recent invention, and its origins are quite murky and sometimes confused. And I think this is perhaps a good example in that Australia's ideas of its origins have been dominated by Cook and also by Arthur with Philip rather, with the First Fleet. But are there other national streams kind of flowing in Australian consciousness, and what might happen to those in the future?
Yeah, well, that's a very big question.
It's a very long question, sorry.
Of course, Cook only sailed up sailed up the eastern coast of what we now call Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. And when he made that famous claim for King George, he only claimed that little bit. So in Tasmania, you're lucky. He never claimed Tasmania, and he never claimed Western Australia or South Australia or the Northern Territory, because he said the Dutch had already been there. And therefore, under the laws around discovery, he wasn't permitted to claim that. The Dutch had first claim. And but of course, when you made that claim back then, that was only half of what had to be done. That was a bit like putting the red sticker on the painting. You still had to come along and pay for it, which is what Philip did. You had to come in and settle it to make good on that claim. And I don't think there's any accident that he first stops at Botany Bay, and that's where Philip lands, and that it is very much, it's New South Wales. It was New South Wales. It was historians in New South Wales, when New South Wales started to gain self-government. They were the first ones to really start getting a bit excited about Cook and wanting to build a monument and try and build him up. Before the 1850s, I think Philip was more in people's minds. You know, that's why Australia Day was celebrated on when Philip arrived, not when Cook arrived. And I guess most of the history books, most of the artworks that we see in our art galleries, they're made in Sydney and Melbourne, in that bit that Cook, you know, that Cook, where Cook is more present. So I guess that's why Cook is important. But the real reason that Cook is so important is because of that claim. You know, he made that legal claim in the name of King George, or, you know, legal according to sort of international law back in 1770. He wrote it in his journal. He wrote in his journal that he raised the flag and that he had this little ceremony. Whether he actually did or not, doesn't sort of matter. What's important is that it appeared in his journal, and so he had proof that that claim was made, and that was really a claim for the British Empire, not for the Australian nation, which was in no one's imagination even at that point. So
and it could have been quite different too for those of you who have dipped into Cook's journal. When he left New Zealand, heading for New Holland, he was actually trying to navigate towards Adventure Bay on Bruny Island, because what's his name?
Why?
Ferner. Can't think of the name of the British navigator who'd been there before him. Doesn't matter. It's gone out of my mind. But he actually ended up too far north and missed Van Diemen's Land completely. So if he'd actually succeeded in what he was trying to do, he would have made landfall.
he would have claimed Tasmania as well.
Van Diemen's Land. Yeah, and of course there is also a suggestion that he sailed so far into Bass Strait that he concluded that Van Diemen's Land must have been an island, but wasn't prepared to divulge that in his journals under Admiralty instruction, because that would have given.
Well, you know, the other interesting story is that he didn't actually, in New Zealand, he didn't want to actually sail across to Australia. He wanted to go the other way. Sorry, I think I've dropped out, have I?
No, you're there. For purely, Roo...
where are we? I can't hear anyone.
Roo, for purely selfish reasons, can I ask you a question about the conquest?
Yes.
Now, it recently dawned on me why the Fab Four, aka the Beatles, are sitting there in the boat, and that is they were responsible for the British invasion when they turned up.
Well, actually, the truth about the Beatles is it's a corny little play. Australia brought the cane toads out to Australia to kill and wipe out the silver beetles, and the Beatles were the Quarrymen, and then their second name was the Silver Beatles, and then they cut it to Beatles.
Oh, very
So
good.
I was having, if you want to have a lot of fun and not sell many of these prints, you turn it into something a bit comical. And there's a little spray can down the bottom that says "Hop Stop," and the company director and co-director fought tooth and nail who would get the artist proof. So a bit of product placement in your artwork really pays off.
And my other question was, what's with the Dalmatian?
I don't know. I've looked. I knew someone would ask me that, and there's some specific reason, but I can't remember. So,
And who is the figure behind the Dalmatian?
oh yeah, I can't know. I don't know, but it is Cook in the foreground, and I've done. They've made beer out of sugar, and they've got widely drunk. And apparently, Cook was. I don't know if he was a big drinker, but he was. Everyone was sick of being on the boat for 3 years. And that's why Cook is presumed to have made poor decisions on reclaiming small boats and kidnapping the high priest, and that's why he was killed.
Thank you, Ru. An interesting question has just come in about tupai, and I'd be interested in anybody jumping in on this one. And the question is, what do you make of the reversal that Pacific historians have done recently by focusing on tupai rather than Cook? I'm going to have to dob somebody in if I don't get an offer.
It's
Ian?
It's a great reversal, obviously, to bring out a figure like Tupai, who is very much, I think, a sort of two-way person. He's an intermediary. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
No.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yep.
I've dropped out, haven't I?
No.
No.
Hugh, can you message Ian to say that he's good to go? Tom, do you have any comment about the figure of Tupai?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, not...
Yeah, Greg got frozen.
Okay, go on, Tom.
Oh, I think, I think it's a very necessary thing, and it's also kind of, I think, salient for this discussion, because in a way, Cook's predominance in the culture means that there's, on the one hand, a necessity to kind of refute that centrality that Cook's given, and also to try to describe Cook in a more historical way in terms of his relationship to a process of invasion and violence. But of course, there's also another process which that invites, which is just to sidestep and not to stop, to talk less about Cook and Banks and all of these figures that, so as Julie said in her reference to the necessity of an audit, that they're wildly overrepresented in the telling of this complex history, and instead to give proper space to other figures like Tupai, and there are many other figures in the history of this continent who need to be instated in their fullness, and who performed incredibly intricate intercultural roles as well as leadership in resistance. So I think it's super interesting, and it helps. The other thing I think is really important is that it helps to make the story less nationalist and more about actually a series of connections between different land masses in the Pacific. I mean, and one of the interesting people who we haven't mentioned yet, but who is in this from an art historical nerd point of view, is Bernard Smith. And I think what Bernard Smith does in European Vision, in thinking Australian art in relation to a complex relationship between a whole lot of different land masses and cultures in the Pacific, is really necessary, and that's part of that same impulse, I think.
Julie.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, thanks, Tom, for that. Yeah, so all of the different approaches and ways of kind of encircling the endeavour, yeah, or these ships seem to be like floating villages with many people undertaking their own lives and with their own agendas and possibilities and outcomes. So yeah, I think it's really important work, particularly if those that are doing the work now are connected with those original voyages. So yeah, like Tahitian historians, Tahitian like artists from those that we're talking about, that come from those origins. I'm thinking about these ships also as bringing another kind of memorial with them, another kind of monument, which is their kind of ground claiming by leaving this trail of introduced place names where they, during or afterwards. And so what this means for us, these instated, it's actually more significant than a bronze man in a park, this legacy of place naming that needs addressing. Yeah.
So let's pick up on this question about the future. And right at the moment, the arts have probably never been under quite as much pressure and squeeze in terms of public funding. The humanities are under threat. So how effective can artists be in these times, or even in the best of times, in doing something that's meaningful for the future? Is it enough just to be doing what we're doing with this exhibition and trying to critique white origin myths by focusing on this guy Cook, who is really just a cipher for all of the problems that we live with today? Are you taking on your shoulders more than you can bear? Tom?
Julie. You go first, Julie.
No, I just, next year Cook will be over again, yeah. And I'm just concerned and committed to, 1,300, loss of 3,000 our land, and yeah. So this is the Cook conversation that we've got to have, or something, yeah. So yeah, for me, I can't really comment in that. Yeah, he is representative of so much else. Yeah, that I've kind of gone beyond Cook, yeah. But so you should, yeah. So, I don't know why I said that. In that other people should say what they know or think about Cook. I'm just not. I've kind of rushed past Cook in a sense.
And this is what I think we're trying to get at by picking up on the title for the exhibition, because it's not really about Cook, because there are just so many Cooks.
Yeah. So yeah. He's just he's been put there as a kind of the stooge and the patsy type of thing. Yeah, that sort of.
I think you're right, Julie. I think people will get sick of him very quickly and move on. And there's a phenomenal amount of people in Sydney that don't care at all about Cook.
He's just representative of a greater problem for me. So yeah, it's really, but in doing it's useful because we have these opportunities to speak and consider like what came in his wake. Yeah.
I mean, I think I would say that I begin by a kind of confession that I kind of tend to overestimate the role or the power of art because I like it so much. But I do think that like the role of art and artists is in a network of other forms of transformation, that that artworks are incredibly important in relation to the collective actions in a whole range of other spheres of society. And that's how we grapple with these histories and the realities that come from them. So I think that art is immensely powerful, conceived in concert with a whole lot of other types of transformations, whether it's by teachers or lawyers or plumbers, or the full gamut of the way that we collectively organise. So on the one hand, it's a very small role that's part of a much larger process. But I think because one of the things that we struggle with as a contemporary society is how to imagine a collective action, a discipline like art, which is centering around the imaginative and which is also kind of engaging with the way that images have in important ways buttress these processes of invasion, art does become important and interesting as a place to think alternative futures, like how we engage with these histories and their realities, and how we begin to think against them and act against them.
I often wonder.
Well, I tried to address that in my most recent cook, the 2016 Playing for Keeps, and that's why I've got Adam Goods as the wicket keeper. And so I tried to address contemporary issues that are still quite close to people's hearts. And I guess I'm saying that a lot of racial and gender issues are still not being resolved particularly quickly.
The mention of plumbers makes me think about scientists for some reason, and the Cook's expedition, of course, was ostensibly all about the transit of Venus. And there have been other very significant expeditions. The Beagle and Darwin comes to mind. So what about the role of science in all of this? Because social Darwinism has, of course, been responsible for positioning Indigenous people across the world in a very vulnerable, putting them in a very vulnerable state in relation to how knowledge is brokered and how innovation is driven by knowledge. Does anybody have a feeling about science in all of this?
It's kind of how we were valued, like physically brought into science, our ancestors, yeah? And then you think about the French landing and measuring our strength and capacity with their equipment, their scientific equipment. And then I'm thinking of Lisa Rehana's work, which is Transit of Venus, the immense and amazing moving video work, where I think that the voyages in that work are, I think they're enacting various, they're encountering Maori people, and I think there's also a level of that kind of science of the science of that, of the measuring, etc., happening in amongst that video. So I'm just, yeah, it is kind of, it's kind of this excuse. Early anthropologists as well, like the beginning of anthropology. Is it De Gerando, the French voyages, and there's a bay, or I think it's a bay named after him. So the east coast of Tasmania, Van Diemen's Land, then, according to the voyages, were so the French were coming with a different purpose that was more scientific than in being interested in us, more so than the British. But in the end, we became only a nuisance or of scientific interest. We weren't of interest. Our ancestors weren't in any other sense of interest, I think, or to be engaged with beyond that.
It's 4:45, and I think we probably should start winding up. But I just wanted to give all of the panelists and Ian the opportunity to make any final comments or pose any final questions before we wrap up.
I think we're overcooked.
Same time next week we can talk about Bly and the apple trees, yeah, and the breadfruits.
Mm.
Yeah,
I'd be up for that.
All right. Well, I think we should first of all give a very big virtual round of applause to Julie Goff and Ruth Hanks and Tom Nicholson and Ian McLean for making their time available to us and hanging in with us despite the uncooperative nature of Zoom. So thank you all very much. I would also like to to thank Jane Barlow from the Plimsoll Gallery, and you can see behind me, while this exhibition will go online as a virtual exhibition with a wonderful 360-degree walkthrough with video floor talks. We've got 3D high-resolution renderings of some beautiful cultural objects, and as a result of some investment from National Science Week, we'll also have some other educational resources that explore Aboriginal relationships, cultural relationships with biodiversity and climate change, and how those things might be impacting on and manifesting in contemporary art and craft practice. So the site will go live on the 22nd, which is the date that Cook is supposed to have taken possession, and what he did was took possession of the aptly named Possession Island. Whether or not that effectively equated to taking possession of the east coast of Australia, which he wanted everybody to think was the case, I think the jury's still out on that one. And yeah, so please do a search, Too Many Cooks, University of Tasmania, and you'll find that exhibition in all of its glory from the 22nd onwards. So thank you to Jane and the Plimsoll Gallery and the University of Tasmania's cultural collections. A big shout out to the University of Tasmania's Fine Art Collection, the probably third or fourth largest public art collection in Tasmania, which is surrounding the staff and students of the university on every campus all the time, and probably as a result goes completely unnoticed. But it is something that's loved by people who do notice it. And also we've had a great deal of assistance from some Aboriginal fine arts students from the School of Creative Arts and Media. I'd just like to mention Josh Prowse, Reese Romagnoni Townsend, Cassie Sullivan and Dean Gruno, who have been involved in the various complexities of putting a show like this together. And also Hugh Peacock, who's been pulling the levers in the background, helping us to fight against the determined efforts of whoever invented Zoom to stop us from trying to do. So thank you all very much. I've really loved having everybody come together for this, and thank you all very much to the participants from across the planet. I know we have a few people here from Cambridge and Oxford who have dropped in, as well as from across Australia. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to greeting you virtually when you visit the Too Many Cooks exhibition.